Welcome. Today we are doing an intensive examination of a case that is, I think, one of the most complex and, frankly, heartbreaking legal stories in recent Pennsylvania history.
Absolutely. We're talking about the prosecution of Jordan Brown.
A case that starts with just a shocking, devastating crime back in 2009.
And it then just winds its way through almost a decade of court battles.
Yeah, and in the process, it sets these critical precedents about how the American justice system is supposed to treat children, especially when they're accused of the most serious offenses imaginable.
And this analysis isn't just about, looking at a timeline of events. It's really about dissecting the tension between, on one hand, state laws that mandate adult charges,
Right.
and on the other, the core principles of juvenile justice. What makes this case so significant, really, is that it all came down to the very foundation of criminal law.
Because
The sufficiency of evidence, the amount of proof you need to overcome the presumption of innocence.
And the facts at the center of this are just fundamentally tragic. We have to approach this with the solemnity it deserves.
We do.
Jordan Brown, born in 1997, was just 11 years old. 11. And he was charged with the fatal shooting of his father's pregnant fiancée, Kenzie Marie Huck, who was 26.
The loss here is just immense. It's twofold. Kenzie Huck was 8 months pregnant.
So both she and her unborn son died. And that immediate focus on an 11-year-old suspect just put this whole case under an international spotlight. It really demanded that we look critically at how the justice system responds when a child is involved in this kind of violence. So what we want to explore for you today is that immediate jarring clash. You have this child, Jordan Brown, and he is immediately subject to these mandatory adult homicide laws.
And that forces this long, painful conflict. It pits the statutory requirements of the state against the fundamental constitutional rights of any defendant.
Particularly a child. I mean, their developmental capacity is completely different from an adult's.
Completely. So we've gathered the full legal history.
Yeah.
We're going to examine the incident itself, the fiercely contested legal maneuvers over jurisdiction.
That's the adult court versus juvenile court fight.
Exactly. Then the long court proceedings that span 9 years, and finally, the definitive 2018 ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
And that final ruling, it really serves as this powerful reminder that suspicion, no matter how intense it gets.
It does not equate to legal proof.
Let's ground ourselves in the initial incident. Back in 2009, the police investigation. Kenzie Huck was discovered, shot in the back of the head while she was sleeping in her bed.
In the family's western Pennsylvania farmhouse, just a horrifying scene.
Horrifying. And the severity of that crime just immediately drove this high-stakes response from law enforcement.
The timeline of that morning it's very narrow, and it was highly scrutinized. The sources show that Jordan Brown and Kenzie Huck's 7-year-old daughter left the house together.
To catch their school bus.
Right. They walked down the path away from the farmhouse, and it was only about 45 minutes after they left that Huck's 4-year-old daughter, who was still in the house.
She alerted nearby tree cutters about the situation.
Yes, and that led to the discovery of the crime.
So that very narrow time frame, that period between the older kids leaving and the discovery, it just immediately concentrated the investigation on who was in the household.
And the Pennsylvania State Police, they quickly formulated a theory, and it centered on Jordan Brown.
The state prosecutor's theory really rested on two major pillars, right? The weapon and the physical evidence tying that weapon to the route he took.
That's it. The weapon they identified as the murder tool was a youth model Harrington and Richardson 20-gauge shotgun.
And this is where the direct connection to the 11-year-old suspect comes in.
It is. The shotgun had been a Christmas gift to Jordan from his father, Chris Brown.
And the source confirmed he was an active hunter. He would go out with his dad on weekends, which means he was familiar with the weapon, he knew how to handle it.
And he knew where it was kept.
Yeah.
This contest immediately made him the focal point of the whole inquiry.
Absolutely. So then came the physical evidence the police relied on.
During their initial sweep, the investigators found a spent shotgun shell casing.
And crucially, they found this casing near the path that Jordan Brown walked with Huck's older daughter to get to the school bus.
Right. And this discovery just solidified the narrative for them.
The shooting happened. The youth gets rid of the casing on his way to the bus, and then he just goes to school as if nothing happened.
So from the police perspective at that moment, you can see how it looked. They had the victim, a very tight time frame, the type of weapon.
They knew who owned the weapon.
And they had physical evidence, a spent shell right on the path the suspect took away from the scene. It's a compelling picture, even if it's circumstantial. And it led to immediate action.
But this is where we need to introduce a really critical piece of context, something the Supreme Court eventually forced into the spotlight.
Investigative tunnel vision.
Exactly. While the focus so quickly narrowed on Jordan, the source material notes there was another individual who, should have raised some serious flags early on.
Adam Harvey, an ex-boyfriend of Kenzie Hook.
That's a powerful detail to bring in here. Why was he a concern?
Kenzie Hook had a restraining order against him, and the documents behind that order were very concerning. She claimed he had threatened to kill her and her family.
So you have a documented threat of violence from an ex-partner, someone who was legally barred from even contacting her.
Right, and that stands in really sharp contrast to the immediate, almost exclusive focus on an 11-year-old.
This fact, which the defense later highlighted, it suggests that the police's theory about Jordan was embraced so quickly that other reasonable lines of inquiry
involving a documented violent threat.
Right. They may have been neglected.
That context casts a shadow over the entire initial investigation, and that shadow just grew as the legal process went on.
But at the time, the police acted decisively on their chosen theory.
They did. Jordan Brown was interviewed twice by the state police on February 20th, the day of the discovery.
And this is the first major flashpoint of the case. It shows the legal reality in Pennsylvania at the time.
He was arrested the very next morning, before sunrise, at age 11.
And the Lawrence County District Attorney's Office filed charges. Not in juvenile court.
No, they filed in adult court.
This just sounds insane to the average person.
Yeah.
Why? Why was an 11-year-old mandated to be charged as an adult for homicide?
It was a deeply problematic feature of Pennsylvania law back then. State law at the time required that all homicide cases, no matter the age of the defendant,
Had to be filed in adult criminal court first.
It wasn't prosecutorial choice. It wasn't them saying this is a heinous crime, so we're choosing to go to adult court. It was a statutory mandate. They had no choice.
And that one legal requirement just set the stage for nearly a decade of constitutional conflict.
So this 11-year-old boy was legally classified as an adult criminal suspect right from the start.
And we know from the sources that this led to him being put in an adult facility, at least initially.
Correct. Jordan was first placed in the Lawrence County Jail, an adult facility. His defense attorneys obviously immediately challenged this.
On what grounds?
They argued that the physical setting of the jail, it was described as having 3 cell blocks, it couldn't safely or legally accommodate a child of 11.
But that argument was successful.
It was. By March of 2009, he was transferred to a juvenile center. But while that was an early victory for the defense, in terms of his physical environment...
The core legal challenge was still there.
Exactly. His case was still formally lodged in the adult criminal court system, and that carried with it the prospect of an adult sentence.
So this battle over jurisdiction, which legal system would ultimately try and sentence Jordan Brown, it became the defining fight for the next 2 years.
And the stakes, they just could not have been higher.
The difference between an adult conviction and a juvenile adjudication was what? The difference between a lifetime behind bars and being released at 21.
We really need to clearly outline those stakes for you, the listener, to understand the urgency of this fight. If Jordan had been convicted as an adult, the legal landscape was devastating.
There was talk of mandatory life without parole.
There was, though, for those under 15. The legal precedent in Pennsylvania at the time was pointing more toward life with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
Even with parole, that means he wouldn't even be eligible until his late 30s.
At best. Now, contrast that with the juvenile system.
Okay.
In the juvenile system, the maximum disposition, that's what they call a sentence, is custody in a secure juvenile detention center only until the defendant turns 21.
For Jordan Brown, that meant release by August of 2018.
So you have a 25-year minimum versus a 9-year maximum. That chasm in sentencing, it just illustrates why that procedural fight to move jurisdiction was everything.
And this stark contrast, it drew a lot of attention from human rights organizations, didn't it?
It did. They saw the mandatory adult charge as a gross violation of international norms for child welfare and justice.
So Amnesty International got involved.
That's right. They actively opposed the effort to try him as an adult. They argued forcefully that mandatory life sentences for children, even with parole, violated fundamental international law. This wasn't just some domestic legal squabble. It was seen globally as an abuse of justice principles.
And the pressure wasn't just international. There was a domestic outcry, too.
A big one. A petition with nearly 4,000 signatures protested what they saw as the denial of Brown's Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights.
Highlighting concerns about the fairness of proceedings against a child?
And you have to remember, the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, they're foundational.
But when you're dealing with an 11-year-old being interviewed by police, these rights are exponentially harder to protect.
Especially when the system is designed from the outset to treat him as an adult.
Let's talk about the decertification process. This is the legal move the defense team pursued, a motion to decertify the case from adult court and transfer it down to juvenile court.
Yes. And the presiding judge at the time, Judge Dominic Motto, he initially denied this request.
And his reasoning for denying it was, well, it was explosive.
It was legally and constitutionally dangerous. Judge Motto denied the transfer because Jordan Brown would not admit his involvement in the crime.
Wait, say that again?
The judge's logic was that the juvenile system is for rehabilitation, and he believed that admitting guilt is a prerequisite for successful rehabilitation.
So if you don't confess,
Then you aren't suitable for the juvenile system, and you have to stay in the adult system.
let me make sure I understand this. The judge said, if you claim you're innocent, you must be tried as an adult and you can face life in prison. But if you confess, you can go to the juvenile system.
That's it.
Isn't that the definition of using the threat of punishment to coerce a confession?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It created this legal paradox. A defendant had to choose between exercising his constitutional right to remain silent and maintain his innocence,
Which would cost him access to the more lenient juvenile system.
or waive that right, confess to a crime just to gain access to rehabilitation. It is a direct, palpable violation of the Fifth Amendment right against compelled self-incrimination.
And the appellate courts, they saw this severe flaw pretty quickly.
They did. The Pennsylvania Superior Court reviewed this reasoning, and they swiftly ruled that Judge Motto's decision violated Brown's Fifth Amendment rights.
The court recognized you can't penalize a defendant, even indirectly, for exercising the right to maintain their innocence.
It's fundamentally unconstitutional.
That ruling was a massive win, not just for Jordan Brown, but as a legal precedent for juvenile defendants all across the state.
It was, and the pressure was immense. Judge Motto recused himself from the case after the Superior Court's decision.
A new judge, Judge John W. Hodge, took over.
Right, and Judge Hodge reviewed the case under this new constitutionally sound mandate, and he subsequently granted the decertification petition.
This is the turning point.
It was. The case was finally moved from adult court to Lawrence County's Family Court Division. Jordan Brown would be processed as a juvenile.
That years-long fight over jurisdiction was finally over.
But the fight over guilt, that was just beginning.
So now that the case is finally settled in juvenile court, the focus shifts entirely from jurisdiction to the actual evidentiary hearing.
And the language changes, too. It's not a trial and a guilty verdict anymore. Now it's an adjudication hearing and a finding of delinquency.
But before that hearing could even begin, there was another procedural battle that got a lot of public attention.
The question of public access.
Right. Juvenile proceedings are historically confidential. They're designed to protect the minor's identity and their future. But the seriousness of this charge, the press was demanding transparency.
And Judge Hodge, he recognized the nature of the defendant and the goals of juvenile justice. He ruled that Brown's adjudication hearing would not be open to the public or the news media.
And that ruling was immediately contested.
Of course, 3 influential regional newspapers, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, and the Newcastle News, they all appealed that decision,
Arguing that the public's right to know in a case of this magnitude outweighed the juvenile confidentiality rules.
They pushed hard for the hearing to be open, but the Pennsylvania Superior Court rejected their appeal.
So the hearing stayed closed. It proceeded behind closed doors, which removed a layer of public oversight.
Which ironically may have actually intensified the public scrutiny of the eventual outcome.
The hearing lasted 3 days. The court heard testimony, reviewed the evidence, the shotgun, the spent shell casing, the timeline.
And crucially, the lack of any forensic evidence directly tying Jordan to the act. The atmosphere in that room must have been incredibly tense.
Especially since the whole premise of a juvenile trial is rehabilitation, not just punishment.
Following those 3 days, Judge Hodge issued his ruling. This was April 13th, 2012.
Jordan Brown, who is now 15, was adjudicated as delinquent.
The juvenile court equivalent of a guilty verdict. He was found responsible for first-degree murder in the death of Kenzie Hick and homicide in the death of her unborn male child.
And the disposition or sentence?
It followed the maximum penalty allowed in the juvenile system. Brown was ordered to be held in a juvenile rehabilitative treatment facility until he turned 21.
Which, as we said, would have been August 2018. A substantial sentence. It would have effectively been his entire adolescence.
But this finding of delinquency was far from conclusive. It immediately went up on appeal. And this marks the beginning of this years-long legal loop that just showed how much difficulty the courts had assessing this circumstantial evidence.
The very first appeal led to a huge reversal.
A massive one. On May 8, 2013, the Superior Court intervened again and vacated the finding of delinquency.
They erased the conviction.
Essentially, yes.
And what was the justification for such a dramatic move? They used a very powerful legal phrase, didn't they?
They did. They cited a palpable abuse of discretion.
That phrase is really significant. What does it mean in this context?
It means the lower court's finding wasn't just based on a misinterpretation of the law. It means its decision was clearly contrary to the facts or to establish principles of justice. It's a very strong censure of the juvenile court's reasoning.
And what specifically was the nature of that abuse of discretion?
The Superior Court objected to the juvenile court's core logical leap. The juvenile court had assumed that no one else but Jordan could have shot Huck.
This is the classic judicial error when you're dealing with circumstantial evidence.
It is. Instead of proving that Jordan did commit the act, the court improperly concluded that because he was the most obvious suspect, all other possibilities must be eliminated.
Even if the evidence didn't explicitly eliminate them.
Right. They were relying on elimination rather than on affirmative proof.
So the appellate court was basically saying that the evidence presented, even if you believe every bit of it, it did not legally meet the standard to rule out reasonable doubt.
Exactly. The evidence might point toward Jordan, but it didn't exclude others, especially when you consider the alternative suspect, Adam Harvey, who had already been mentioned in the defense's arguments.
So the finding of delinquency was erased, and the case was sent back to the juvenile court for reconsideration.
Forcing Judge Hodge to review the evidence again, this time without making that unconstitutional assumption.
This created a judicial marathon. Jordan Brown is still in custody this whole time while the court system struggles with this insufficient evidence.
2 years later, Judge Hodge issues a second opinion. This is April 19th, 2015.
And despite the Superior Court's clear guidance.
The judge again found Jordan responsible for the killings. It was clear the juvenile court was highly convinced of his guilt, even if the appellate courts felt the legal requirements just weren't being met.
So naturally, the defense pursued a third appeal, back up to the Superior Court.
And this time, in September of 2016, the Superior Court delivered a split-panel decision.
And confusingly, they affirmed the juvenile court's ruling.
This split decision is very telling. It just highlights how ambiguous the circumstantial evidence really was. One part of the panel felt that the judge's second opinion had adequately addressed the initial concerns about abuse of discretion.
So they essentially concluded that, while difficult, the circumstantial case was just strong enough to support the finding of delinquency.
Which meant that, legally, Jordan was still delinquent for murder.
By this time, the legal process had been grinding on for over 7 years.
And yet, despite the delinquency finding now standing after that third appeal, Jordan Brown was released from juvenile custody in June 2016.
2 months before his 19th birthday.
His release was based on the constraints of the juvenile system. I mean, while his case was still being actively appealed, with the state Supreme Court as the final destination.
He was nearing the upper age limit of the juvenile court's jurisdiction.
Exactly.
So where was he released to, given the severity of the charge that was still technically affirmed against him?
Judge Hodge placed him on probation in the custody of an uncle in Ohio, which is just across the state line from Lawrence County.
So he was living under these immense constraints. Still technically on juvenile probation, still a convicted juvenile delinquent for murder, until he turned 21.
While his lawyers, meanwhile, pursued the highest possible level of appeal.
This scenario is just remarkable. You have a college-aged individual trying to attend school, trying to rebuild his life.
All while carrying the legal designation of a juvenile murderer. This relentless legal battle, it all hinged on the quality of that initial evidence from 2009.
And that evidence was about to face the scrutiny of Pennsylvania's highest court.
The final stage of this 9-year saga began when the defense successfully secured a certiorari request.
which means the Pennsylvania Supreme Court agreed to hear the appeal.
Right. And they didn't agree to hear it to discuss procedure or the Fifth Amendment issues. Those were mostly settled. They agreed to assess one core question.
Was the evidence sufficient as a matter of law to sustain the adjudication of delinquency?
This is the critical juncture. The Supreme Court wasn't interested in whether the trial judge meant well or if the juvenile system was appropriate. They were asking if the foundational facts could support a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt.
And the outcome was definitive.
And unanimous. On July 18, 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction in a decisive 5-0 decision.
And it's worth noting, as the sources point out, that the two justices who didn't participate had previously ruled in Brown's favor when they served on the Superior Court.
Which just reinforces this strong legal consensus against the original finding.
The legal reasoning behind this reversal is, I think, the most important element of this entire discussion. The justices attack the evidence as insufficient. How did they break down the prosecution's case?
This is a masterclass in applying legal standards. Circumstantial evidence, by its very definition, it requires the court to draw inferences.
Okay.
And for that evidence to sustain a conviction, the inferences drawn must exclude every reasonable hypothesis except that of guilt. The evidence has to point only to the defendant.
And the Supreme Court found that the prosecution's evidence failed spectacularly to meet this standard.
Spectacularly.
Let's look specifically at the two main pieces of evidence: the shotgun and the spent shell casing found near the path.
Okay. The court acknowledged that Jordan owned a 20-gauge shotgun and that a 20-gauge shotgun was used, but they pointed out the evidence connecting the specific shotgun in Brown's bedroom to the murder was incredibly weak.
They determined that the evidence supporting the theory that it was the murder weapon
Supported an equally reasonable conclusion that it was not the murder weapon.
That's the crucial legal phrase, equally reasonable conclusion. Can you break down why the evidence failed to eliminate doubt, especially with the ballistics?
So the prosecution argued that the shell casing found near the path connected the crime to Jordan's route. But the defense successfully argued, and the Supreme Court agreed, that while the shell matched the caliber of the gun,
the state failed to definitively prove the shell was fired by that specific shotgun in Jordan's room.
Right. Shotguns are notoriously difficult to link definitively to a single shell casing, not like rifles or handguns, which leave unique markings on bullets.
Plus, the defense pointed out that Jordan's father and other adults frequently hunted on the property. 20-gauge shells were common.
Exactly. So the proximity of the shell casing to his route, strong suspicion, sure, but the actual forensic link failed to exclude the possibility that the shell was just an old, spent casing from a prior hunting trip.
Or fired by another shotgun entirely.
Precisely. If the physical evidence connecting the gun to the crime is inconclusive and the gun itself is owned by the family, not just the suspect, the whole foundation of the prosecution's theory just dissolves.
The timeline evidence was also questioned.
It was. While Jordan was in the house during that critical window, the exact time of death was not specific enough to definitively exclude other people.
Especially given the known threat posed by the ex-boyfriend Adam Harvey, whose whereabouts were not as rigorously investigated.
Right. The Supreme Court opinion, which was written by Justice Deborah Todd, it really didn't leave any room for ambiguity.
What did she write?
She stated clearly, the Commonwealth's evidence was, therefore, insufficient as a matter of law to overcome appellant's presumption of innocence, and the juvenile court's adjudication of his delinquency for these serious crimes must be reversed.
So the reversal wasn't based on a procedural error.
No, it was a fundamental failure of proof.
And the final action taken by the Supreme Court was to order that appellant is discharged. What's the profound consequence of that order?
That order provided complete finality. Because the reversal was based on a finding of insufficient evidence, not procedural errors, it invokes the protection of the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause.
Meaning he cannot be retried for these crimes.
Never.
Yeah.
Regardless of any new evidence the state might uncover, the case is legally and definitively closed against him. After 9 years, the legal system found that the state never proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
The Jordan Brown case serves as this really jarring illustration of the cost of mandatory adult charging laws and an investigative tunnel vision. The legal ambiguity around the evidence allowed this case to drag on for nearly a decade, and it devastated the life of a child.
He was arrested at 11? The case was resolved when he was 21. He spent more than 3 years in a juvenile detention facility, while his lawyers fought to establish that he was, at the very least, entitled to the presumption of innocence.
That institutionalization, combined with the continuous legal uncertainty, must have taken a massive psychological toll.
A massive one. He was released at 18, still appealing a murder conviction and trying to function as a college student while his entire future just hung in the balance.
The source material notes he's been very open about the lasting effects of this experience.
That's right. Brown has said repeatedly that he suffers from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a direct consequence of the arrest, the incarceration, and this prolonged judicial process.
He has committed himself to moving forward studying computer science.
But the trauma of being put through the adult-mandated system as a child accused of murder, that is an indelible mark on his life.
The ultimate exoneration by the Supreme Court just raises these significant questions about the initial investigation.
It has to. The fact that the evidence was deemed insufficient, combined with the presence of a known, documented threat, Adam Harvey, the ex-boyfriend with the restraining order, it suggests a failure in balancing the investigation.
When police focus exclusively on one convenient narrative,
in this case, the child who owned the gun,
they risk overlooking crucial pieces of information that could point toward the truth.
The threat assessment against Kenzie Huck should have, by necessity, involved a rigorous inquiry into Adam Harvey's whereabouts and his alibi that day.
And the Supreme Court ruling essentially confirmed the defense's assertion that the state's focus was too narrow, and the evidence they did gather was simply not enough to overcome the shadow of reasonable doubt.
This case is a powerful lesson in constitutional jurisprudence. It highlights the extreme vulnerability of minors when they're confronted with laws that strip them of procedural protections designed for children.
When a system mandates adult charges for homicide, regardless of age, it forces defendants as young as 11 into a legal framework built for maximum punishment.
Not one built on developmental principles and rehabilitation. It forced the judicial system to deal with the fact that its own mandatory charging rules created constitutional conflicts.
And it necessitated these extraordinary measures, like the Superior Court stepping in to protect the Fifth Amendment, and ultimately the Supreme Court examining the basic sufficiency of the state's case.
Which brings us to a crucial final point for you to consider. This discussion really illuminates the difficult, necessary task of balancing the seriousness of a crime like homicide. Again, we reflect on the senseless loss of Kenzie Huck and her unborn son.
With the unique constitutional rights and developmental vulnerability of a child suspect, the Jordan Brown case shows that the legal standard of proof must remain absolute.
Particularly when a child's entire future, potentially a lifetime of liberty, is at stake.
How effectively can the justice system ever balance mandatory adult sentencing laws against the needs of juvenile defendants, especially when the evidence relies on such shaky circumstantial foundations? That tension remains unresolved in many jurisdictions today.
The Supreme Court ruling ensures that the principle of presumed innocence was ultimately upheld. 9 years too late for Jordan Brown's childhood, but definitively establishing a high bar for evidence in these incredibly serious and sensitive cases.
So to bring together the primary threads of this discussion, we track the case from the mandated adult charge for an 11-year-old, which just defined the case from the very beginning.
And that mandate led directly to that critical Fifth Amendment battle, successfully challenging the judge who demanded a confession as a condition for rehabilitation,
which resulted in the transfer to juvenile court.
And we saw how, even in juvenile court, the initial adjudication was marked by appellate findings of palpable abuse of discretion, forcing years of agonizing legal appeals.
And finally, the relentless legal effort culminated in that 2018 Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling.
A decision based entirely on the insufficiency of the evidence, finding that the circumstantial case failed to eliminate the possibility of innocence, which led to Jordan Brown's definitive discharge and protection from future prosecution.
It's a profound, if painful, demonstration of the power of that legal standard. The system has to operate based on proof, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Not simply on the elimination of the most convenient suspect.
Indeed. This case serves as a powerful argument for reassessing policies that dictate how we treat children in criminal justice.
Especially those policies that mandate they face adult courts regardless of their age or the quality of the evidence against them.
Thank you for listening.